Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning and hope you've had a chance to get something to eat. I'm Jennifer Bachner, and I direct the Master of Science in Government Analytics program here at Johns Hopkins, and we also have a Certificate in Government Analytics program. And we co-host this Government Analytics Breakfast Forum with REI Systems. We meet together about once every other month, and the purpose is to create a community of people who are in industry, government, and academia to discuss some of the challenges and solutions that government is grappling with when thinking about how they can solve political, policy, and governance challenges using analytics. So we very much hope that these forums serve as an opportunity to both network and also have a discussion about analytics. So we very much encourage your participation. Welcome to those of you who are watching online as well, and you're encouraged to submit questions to our panel using the text box below the video. So our speakers, our panel here will present for approximately 30 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for some Q&A and discussion afterwards. I also would encourage you to tweet about our forum using the hashtag GAB Forum, and if you're struggling with accessing the internet, there's some Wi-Fi instructions here on this pillar here. We will be posting a recording of the event about 24 to 48 hours afterwards, so if you'd like to revisit anything that was discussed or if you'd like to share it with any of your colleagues, you're welcome to use that recording. And I think that's about all of the programming information again I have. So welcome once again. We really appreciate you taking time out of your day to be with us, and I will let my colleague Jeff Myers at REI Systems introduce our panel.
Thank you. Let me say, for background, a number of you are new, some of you I've had a chance to meet before, but the purpose of this event really is to give people within government a chance to meet others in government facing analytics challenges so that they have kind of a resource network to help them think through how to tackle problems they haven't faced before and to succeed in doing that. Also, a lot of the reason we assemble these panels is to kind of provide that same sort of knowledge transfer, to be able to help you understand what are some of the folks who are kind of leading in a variety of different analytic fields doing, and how do they do it, and give you a chance to ask them questions and to learn about it. There are some kind of peripheral benefits as well. So, for example, if you're interested in hiring students from Johns Hopkins, or if you think you'd like to advance your own education, this is intended to do that as well. But it's also generally to promote kind of the use of analytics in government. And one of the things I'm particularly proud about that I don't know we've mentioned before is the ACT-IAC, American Council for Technology Industry Advisory Councils, has an annual Igniting Innovation competition. And this past annual Igniting Innovation competition saw more than 130 government agencies and at state, local, as well as federal, indicate what they thought their best innovation had been. And the top winner, the first place winner, was a winner in analytics. And actually, I'm proud because REI knows a fair bit about this. Our client, with our support, was able to win that award for use of analytics in improving health outcomes for people who are served, underprivileged people who are served by public health clinics around the country. So the other couple of things I'd like to mention just briefly as advertisements for REI is that we are hiring. If you are interested in both government analytics and would like to be able to make an impact in support of a number of different government agencies, REI would be very happy to talk to you. And as well, REI and Johns Hopkins University are coming out co-sponsoring a survey on the use of government analytics. It'll be issued roughly within the next month. So please look forward to it. If you have been on the invitation list for these events, you will get a chance to respond to the survey and you can share it with your friends. But the purpose of it will be to do things like say, who's using analytics? What types of things are they using it for? What purposes? What types of analytics are they using? What types of people are doing the work? There are a couple of questions that will get at the really tough part, which is how much value is being obtained from the use of analytics. But we think it'll be something that will give a great overall picture across government and to a certain extent the private sector that works with government to be able to give people an ability to say, well, hey, a lot of people are doing something we haven't tried yet. Maybe we should try that. Or people are relying on this sort of analytics now, and they expect to be relying on that type of analytics in the future. So I think it'll give kind of a government-wide insight that is not available right now, and the results of it will be fascinating. And bluntly, we're going to be sharing the results of that survey in the fall at a forum just like this. So they'll, of course, be open and available to the public. We'll probably share them with one or another media organization as well, and they may be published so that you can see them a little more broadly. But enough about kind of the analytics in this forum and REI. Let me now introduce our panelists, and I'll tell you briefly as an introduction, what I thought to myself and then conversed with Jen Bachner was, people don't necessarily, many of them understand, well, how could I use artificial intelligence? How could it be valuable? And I thought, the easiest way to figure that out is to find where it's being used now and successfully. And who would be the best folks to do that? Well, the people who have a good perspective across government. So I invited Keith Nakasone and Marina Fox as representatives of the General Services Administration to tell us who is buying artificial intelligence across government and for what purposes. And they told me, actually I was quite pleased, they said, not only are we helping organizations across government buy artificial intelligence, often as part of a larger procurement, but we're also using it ourselves. And so we can tell you a little bit about how we use it in the results. And I thought that would be fantastic. But I always like to ask more. So I said, can you please help identify someone else from another agency so we can kind of get a comparison contrast, someone who's really using artificial intelligence effectively. And so they identified and invited Terry Carpenter, who's from the Department of Defense, and in particular is the Program Executive Officer for the National Background Investigation Service. So each of these kind folks are going to share with you a little bit of their experience with artificial intelligence, of how it's actually been implemented, and to a certain extent kind of what results have been obtained. They're, of course, at varying stages of implementation. But also you'll have a chance to hear a little bit about kind of the government-wide perspective. They've asked, and I would like to ask as well, that you hold your questions until after they've finished describing the use cases, which will be kind of about a third or a little more of the way into the presentation. And at that point, you please feel free to ask questions. These are always much more interesting events, I think, if there is some discussion going back and forth. And I've actually encouraged our panelists to ask questions of the audience as well. There are a number of folks in the audience that I know are from the Federal Aviation Administration, the Office of Personnel Management, the Government Accountability Office, and a number of other agencies. And I suspect you have some experience that may be informative as well. So please don't hesitate not just to ask questions, but also to offer some points that you may find would be useful to your peers. So with that, and no further ado, please let me invite our panel to begin their presentation. And thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Great, thanks. So let me go to the slides first. So when we talk about, first, my name is Keith Nakasone. I am from the General Services Administration. I am in charge of the IT acquisitions operations, so basically the Schedule 70 program, as well as the large IT government-wide contracts, such as Alliant, VETS 2, STARS 2, EIS, which is the large telecommunications contract. So there's a number of them that I oversee. We support federal, state, local agencies with our schedules program. One of the things that we're trying to do is deliver not just products, not just services, but IT solutions as well through our vehicles. So one of the things that we're doing in an acquisition playbook is we're looking at how people buy and procure. So we're finding that emerging technologies are being embedded into products and services already. And if we have best practices that have been adopted either by private that can be injected into public, we would like to take that and leverage it and potentially put it on our schedule or through our contract vehicles. This way we can operate in the mindset of doing the agile build out, where we're taking what we call the crawl, walk, run format, where we're learning, and as we do proof of concepts, we do pilots, dev, and moving into operations and sustainment. So we're building the acquisition vehicles so that it's easier to enter into the market and bring existing systems and emerging technologies together. So we're finding that a lot of the OEMs that are building is just layering artificial intelligence right on top of their products and services, which is a good thing when we talk about IT solutions. The main point that I wanted to drive home here is that the communication and collaboration between private and public is so important. As we go down this road and start leveraging emerging technologies, and as we adopt it into our environment, it is going to be a heavy feat for us to take this lift and collaborate well across the different groups so that we are able to put solutions together that will be more successful in the future. Hence why I provide acquisition solutions through contracts, and we have some experts here who actually have to deal with the procurement process and actually put the solutions in play to build out, to support their mission requirements, as well as to make it easier and more efficient for the government agencies. So first I wanted to turn to Marina Fox, who has undertaken one of our largest efforts in the General Services Administration, building something out called the solicitation review tool, and I wanted to give her the opportunity to explain how she's leveraging emerging tech to produce better results for the government.
Thank you, Keith. My name is Marina Fox, and I am .gov program manager. My daily job is basically 80% of the time is to manage the .gov web space, specifically when it comes to .gov websites and the registration of domains. However, in addition to that, analytics has always been part of the work I do, not necessarily because I have to do it, but because it's just, you can't not do analytics anymore because you work with so much data. It has to become part of every step you take. And in addition to that, the digital analytics program that was launched by GSA back in 2012 is also something that I managed at the time, which went through a very extensive procurement process with respect to selecting the right tool and to be able to handle the scale and the scope. So when it comes to AI, when it comes to machine learning at GSA, when it came to the solicitation review tool, which is the product that I'd like to highlight today, it wasn't born as a let's do something AI or let's do something innovative. It clearly was something that we had no other way to accomplish. I work in a division called Government OGP, Office of Government-Wide Policy. One of the things that we do there is ensure that the federal government is up to speed on accessibility, Section 508 law. We provide training to all of the Section 508 coordinators across the federal government to ensure that there is awareness and training when it comes to reviewing statement of works that get issued for then the companies to respond to and for the products to be built. And so historically, when it comes to creating solicitations, the government doesn't have one-stop shop for creating solicitations. Every department does its own thing. There are federal regulations, obviously the FAR. However, the way that each agency handles solicitation reviews is very different, and there isn't one automated tool that scans them for compliance and quality assurance. Approximately, maybe 5-6 years ago, GSA had a contractor who reviewed about 1% of all solicitations that across the government, across the federal government, for Section 508 compliance. I'll give a statistic. Approximately 60 million people in the U.S. have a disability of some sort. And it's our government's mission to ensure that the products that the government builds are accessible to those 60 million. And that number is growing. As you can see, you probably read it in the media. There is, unfortunately, the statistics for disability are only growing. So building products that are accessible, especially as we're digitizing more and more, is very important. It's critical, and it's the law. And so it's not a nice thing to do. It's not an option. It is something that the solicitations must contain, and it's something that the companies must adhere to. However, in practice, solicitations, when it comes to Section 508, oftentimes is an afterthought. And solicitations get published on FedBizOps and other websites that have contain insufficient or lack of Section 508 language. So what happens as a result is the product gets built, website gets built that is not accessible to, let's say, a blind person. And then the best case scenario, it gets caught, it gets corrected. Worst case scenario, an advocacy group finds it, files a complaint, there is a class action suit, Department of Justice has to go and defend the agency. It happened to GSA before, it happened to HHS before, it happened to other agencies. In 2012, we had approximately 140 lawsuits that DOJ had to go and defend the agencies and represent the agencies, where settlements were issued, and sites like SAM.gov, for instance, or HHS.gov had to completely change the way that they deal with accessibility and build their products and review their solicitations. So this is a big deal, and but it all starts with the solicitation quality. And so since my agency, Section 508 team, is responsible for the training, they were saying we just can't seem to push the statistics to go up with respect to solicitation quality. We provide the training, however, solicitations are still anecdotally and based on the small sample of reviews. Approximately 10% of solicitations were compliant with the review when it comes to Section 508. So that means 9 out of 10 did not contain sufficient language, and so products were built without proper accessibility guidelines and requirements. So we had to come up with a way to be able to review the solicitations in a way that would catch the ones that are not compliant. But think about it, just going after FedBiz Ops, there's on average 500 new solicitations posted per day. And when I say solicitations, I'm talking about specifically information and communication technology solicitations, because those are the ones that are subject to Section 508 law. Obviously, if it's a washing machine, it's not. We're talking IT. 500 per day, scanning that every day, catching them as they get posted, then flagging them through some sort of an algorithm, and then sending an email or some sort of a message to the POC of that solicitation saying, hey, your solicitation just posted. It does not contain sufficient language for Section 508. You need to correct it. So the only way we could do it is through some sort of an innovation. And at the time, we had a data scientist on our staff who said, well, let's try something. And that something was open source. Let's have this proof of concept. And that's what Keith was talking about. You have a great idea, you start small, you have to prove it. But in order to do that, a lot of times you don't have the budget, you don't have the resources, you don't have the time to do a major procurement. So you have to work with what you have. You have talent on your team, maybe somebody's 50% of the time who is proficient with and is knowledgeable. So that person said, okay, how about let's get some data, and that some data was based on about 10 years worth of manual reviews of solicitations. Like I mentioned, we had a company that did about 1% of random samples of solicitations that they reviewed manually and then issued letters at the time to those agencies that contained non-compliant solicitations. So he took that data, was approximately 4,000 solicitations that were reviewed, and built a predictive model using Python. It basically became a training data set based on which the predictive model was built to then take new solicitations and be able to, based on that training set, classify them and predict whether they're compliant or not based on the control vocabulary. So when we built that, we built it completely in our office using, like I mentioned, open source. It was an AWS test environment. We used Python for all of the data science work. We used AWS, we used S3 for storage. We used, I forgot, I think it was, at the time it was MongoDB for the database, because this was unstructured data. And we used Node.js for the front end. At the time, the idea was, let's just scan all these, send a bunch of Excel files to these agencies saying, hey, these are the solicitations that are non-compliant. But we quickly realized that it's just not going to sustain itself. It's not going to scale. We can't just send data sets and Excel files to agencies. We need to have some sort of a front end. So it evolved from this idea of, okay, let's just scan some files, to building an enterprise-wide web application that has the data science and has the AI behind it, and it has a really rich front end and interface with a workflow where every day we have new solicitations posted, where 508 coordinators, contract officers can go in and review the solicitations that get flagged for non-compliance, Then we also have a very rich dashboard for analytics to see the conversion. So what happens is, as the solicitations get flagged and the responsible Section 508 coordinators get an email saying these solicitations got flagged for non-compliance, they go in, they review it, and then the correction has to be made. So whoever's responsible, whoever's the POC for that solicitation gets an email saying, please correct your solicitation. They correct it, they post an amendment or a new version of it to FedBiz Ops, and then we pick it up the next 24 hours. And ideally is that we see the conversion from non-compliant to compliant, and then we can track that success, and everything is transparent, and everything is visible. It becomes a KPI, and that way we can actually see the success from the get-go all the way to the conversion of overall across the government. We can see it by agency, we can see it by sub-agency, we can see it government-wide. And it really is unprecedented in our case because we go after the entire population of FedBiz Ops. Now, are there other websites that solicitations get posted? Absolutely, but you got to start with some, and this was sort of the largest and available set for us because we had, as I said, 4,000 solicitations of training that we use as training data. Currently, so as I said, we built in an AWS in the staging environment. When it came down to, okay, let's power this up, let's actually launch this, because coordinators across the government were like, this is amazing, this is great, this is what we need. But what it also, we also discovered, or to some it wasn't really a discovery, it was more of a, oh, I knew it, I just couldn't prove it, is that the compliance rate was extremely low, scary low, to the point where some said, don't release the statistic because this is, I can't believe how low it is. But that's the reality. And that's why this is so important to do these types of undertakings where you go after a population and you check the quality and you use AI and you use innovative solutions where you don't just use a sample, you go across the entire population and you find a way, and a lot of times open source becomes your really go-to because you don't have the luxury of time to do full procurement. But once you prove that concept, then I think it becomes a little bit more sort of evident that, okay, this is really working. We need this. What can we do next? So for the solicitation review tool, right now we are in the final stages of staging. We moved SRT from AWS test environment into cloud.gov. So right now it's we finished all the dev. It's getting ready for UAT, and the UAT is going to be pretty extensive. It's going to start in July of this year, and we're going to have Section 508 coordinators and COTARs and COs from various federal government divisions, basically just using this tool, QAing this tool, getting the feedback that we need in order for them to be able to say in September when we launch, we can use this, it can be actionable right away. Because what we don't want to do is create more work. What we don't want to do is for someone just to have this sit somewhere with hundreds of solicitations that are flagged but they're not reviewing it. So we want it to be actionable, so we need that feedback. We already know that it's already being used and it's already useful, and this is just the start of using this approach to improving the solicitation quality. We already got contacted by several teams within GSA, including FedRAMP, to be able to scan solicitations with the proper language. And I have to mention, this is not just a word search. So when I say we're scanning, it doesn't mean we're just doing a pure word search. We are using natural language processing, but this is algorithm-based. We're using 17 different algorithms as part of the decision on whether something's compliant or not. And then in the future, the AI comes in with neural networks where we're going to be using AI to actually provide suggestions on how to fix those solicitations in the tool. Instead of sending it to the expert and say, add the language, we're going to say, here's the language to add based on this particular scenario. So that's what the version 2 is doing. So the launch date is going to be September this year, and we're very excited. It's been a long road, but we're very excited.
Thanks very much. work through, and as we build the acquisition solutions, we're building it in a way that we can create these gates, if you will, so we don't throw good money after that, if you will. It's really creating that proof of concept solution, then going into a pilot, then the dev, and then operations and sustainment. So I think that's key as we build out our acquisitions, that we create these gates so that we do not throw good money after that. So I think this is a great start. I want to pivot to Department of Defense, because they have a great use case that they're working on. And I've known Terry for quite some time now, and he's one of those that will think outside of the box and push that line on the federal acquisition regulations. Still being compliant, right? But pushing to that edge of how do I get the business needs met through the IT, through the procurement and the IT process. So turn it over to Terry to share his use case.
So again, my name is Terry Carpenter. I'm the PEO for the National Background Investigation Services. How many of you in here have ever gone through the process of getting national security clearance? All right, so that's the vast majority. So when I say to you it's ripe for a lot of change, you probably will nod your head in agreement, right? I think about the shiny object AI analytics. This is great stuff. I mean, you're talking to somebody who has a tremendous deep-formed passion that's been waiting to get out for almost 25 years. I started doing AI, wrote my first natural language processing algorithm in Lisp back in the mid-90s. Unfortunately, back then, the computing power, the storage power was so limited. We did a cool thing around restaurants and how you order, and we were doing some other really neat things with products you may be familiar with called Drag and Dictate. Those kind of technologies were just evolving in the mid-90s. We shelved that pretty much, right? Not much happened with artificial intelligence beyond that in real products. But today, you think about it, all that stuff is in the phone. So it's here to that capability, your Alexa device sitting in your house. You can speak to it. It knows enough to be able to discern what's going on. So we're at a new place where we actually have the compute. It's cheap. It's stored. It's really cheap. Now how do we do AI? Don't focus on AI. I'll say that again. You want to do AI? Stop focusing on AI. Focus on the dozen or so things you have to do to be ready to do AI. And I think you're going to find different use cases got there because of a different journey, right? The journey you just heard. What can we do to fix this little problem? Well, let's try some things here and there. That's great. That's agile. It's quick wins, quick learning, right? Whatever you want to call it. National Background Investigation Service, slightly different scenario. Right? We all receive the letter. How do I get the data? So what we've learned very rapidly is through doing some prototypes and really trying to learn what we can do to change this process. And thank goodness we had some really forward-leaning people within the federal government that made some great decisions to say, let's not only fix the system, which happens to be built around a core of a mainframe. Okay, imagine how agile change happens there. But let's actually transform the process. Let's really do digital transformation. Well, what do we mean by that? The days of you filling out some form, online or paper, whatever it was, submitting this form, having people go through that form, analyze your responses, decide which investigator to go send out there to meet with your parents, your friends, your neighbors, who may all be in different states, to write up reports that assemble a package that grows as we do the investigation to come back to somebody to adjudicate the recommendation to say, should this person have a clearance or not based on policy? Okay, well, we can't do that anymore. That's paper. Imagine you're in the mine in Pennsylvania, and there's this long tunnel in these limestone mines with just wall-to-wall folders going down these shelves, and people going and pulling the folder out, looking at some of that, looking at some data on the screen, trying to assemble these packages. It's not necessarily the most fast way to do that. So in building the new system, building security from the inside out, we really started to look at what do we need to really do artificial intelligence to help this process. The IT folks in the program are not going to be the ones doing artificial intelligence. We're going to enable artificial intelligence to be done. So let's focus on that work. That empowers the business people who are actually trying to execute the mission to figure out what things, what tasks they want to automate that we can help them do with technology. So by focusing on that, we really took a step back and we said, okay, we've got some good successes here. Let's make sure that the enterprise architecture of this application is elastic and scalable. So moving to the cloud is important, not because it's cloud, but because by moving there, you force yourself to rethink your application design. You think about it in terms of elasticity. An application should be able to scale on whatever component it needs as the stresses and demands of that application are pushed. So we did that. We built it, we put it into a cloud architecture so that we could have that elasticity. There is no backup, there is no coup. These are words that I've asked my folks to not say anymore. Because if you're talking about a coup or a backup, you're not talking about an elastic application. One that can't go down. So that was kind of step one. Step two was, where's the data coming from? If we're going to go from this paper process to true digital transformation where we're pulling data from a variety of sources, commercial data sources. There's plenty of commercial data sources out there to tell us about my credit history, tell them about my bank accounts, right? There's good data out there in the law enforcement data that's out. There's federal agencies that have other data sources. We have our own internal data sources. So we need to aggregate that data. Because if I can't get access quickly to the data, what's the use of AI? I'm going to give it to them on a spreadsheet in a file? That's not going to work. So we looked at building an enterprise data broker, and we moved the NBIS architecture to an enterprise data broker concept. We moved the data sources in one place. This gave us the ability to focus on control of that data. I don't have to own it all. It doesn't have to sit on my servers. We have good web services that pull data in real time, but we need to know that we have the connection, we have the ability to pull it when we need it, we know what the data is, what it represents, and we know the policies and agreements, the laws that surround the use of that data. Because as you think about it, as you bring this data together, making sure that the business people trying to implement analytics know what that use is or are protected so that they don't misuse that data is very, very important. So we couldn't rush to the quick answer. We had to do some of these critical, I call them hygiene steps. So now we have the data in a data layer where we have controls, we have ways to lock the data down, not only from what's your role in the system, but what if it's PII? What if it's human subject data in studies for the research community doing that work? We need a way to overlay another security control mechanism that allowed us to say, okay, no matter if I have access to the data or not, this is human subject data, you're not going to see these fields. They're going to be abstracted, right, or tokenized, obfuscated, or all the kind of buzzwords we use in the field. So we focus on some of those layers. And then you think about AI and you think about accreditation, right? System accreditation is very important, especially in our business in the Department of Defense. So we thought about accreditation and said, you know, if you wire all these things together manually and you're constantly wiring your data sources in, then when you look at the security of what you just did with an algorithm or an analytic, it might be a big lift. You might have to look pretty deep at all those steps to really get a good, comfortable feeling about your accreditation of that next release. And that slows the process down. It's not agile. So we really look carefully at how do we manage a platform as a service with as much of the core components that represent what I just spoke about, those underpinning things you need to do analytics well or AI well, and that hygiene stuff, so that when we get to that next release, it's really only the piece that we changed. It's the algorithm we wrote in this neat little container, but it's using all the existing connective tissue to the data. It's using all the policy controls around the data. It's using all the security mechanisms around the data. And therefore, we don't have to go back through a lot of those pieces. So the problem of how do we think about accrediting the security of the analytic or the changes we're making is a lot smaller and therefore a lot simpler, and we can do it much quicker. And we have automation that we put in place to take the human out of the loop of moving things through, using the typical DevSecOps or agile methodologies that you've heard about to help, again, take that problem off the table. So by focusing on a lot of these dozen or so things that you need to do AI well and analytics well, we are going to empower the business people to go through their analysis and figure out, as they learn from the data they do have, what we can do better from there. We are looking at our first AI algorithm. We've got a dozen or so sources. We had a pilot application that was doing what we call continuous evaluation. So the idea, remember, was every 5 or 10 years you go through this process to generate this package to get your clearance reviewed or the initial. Now the idea is we put your name in the system. We already have about 1.1 million names in today in the department as part of the initiative. And it just goes through the data sources on some reoccurring schedule set by the business rules from the business organization. And if an anomaly comes up, then we look at the anomaly and decide what to do with it. They make a decision in their business process what to do with that anomaly that happened. Maybe I got a speeding ticket last night and it popped up on the data source. Okay. So there's a lot of things in the business can think about with how they want to handle that, how they manage that. And again, this gives the opportunity to rethink. It's no longer about looking at me every 5 to 10 years. It's about how do we help our workforce. You're going to hear the term coming from the business about trusted workforce 2.0. We want to know we have a trusted workforce and we want to help that workforce to be able to do that work. We need trusted people to do the work we do. So it's really important. So when you think about it in those terms, I really encourage people to think about those hygiene steps, think about all the pre-work up front. Don't find yourself looking and staring at the cool, shiny thing. Try to look at some of these other things that are less shiny. They're just as important.
Thanks, Terry. So as you can see, you heard 2 different use cases in leveraging emerging technologies, artificial intelligence, and moving into analytics. The thing about, a lot of people are trying to, or agencies are trying to grapple with their data, right? We have a whole lot of data, and as Terry alluded to, we have to focus on not the new shiny word of artificial intelligence, but we really have to do those pre-steps and to get to leveraging artificial intelligence and analytics. So as we go through this process, we're going to evolve over time, right? It's this process, iterative approach to building out solution sets going forward. So as we move through the process, high communication, collaboration is going to be key to success in the different mission areas. We heard from an acquisition side of the house. We heard from the national background investigation process that they have to go through, and their concern is about privacy, about data, and how we can secure that, and role-based approach to accessing that data. So all of this, when we look at from an organizational change, people, process, and technology have to be addressed. So it's not just about the emerging tech. And so with that, we're open to take questions.
Let me start things off by asking one question and then invite everybody else from the audience to do as well. And my question will kind of draw a comparison between the 2 case studies. So in many instances, a kind of a traditional artificial intelligence technique is to say, well, let's get a bunch of historical data and use that to train our machine so that the machine can, to a certain extent, develop its own algorithms, which hopefully will supplement the kind of the human-conceived algorithms. And it was very interesting because, Marina, what you said is, yeah, we have this huge history of past solicitations, and we also know that 90% of them did not comply with Section 508 components. So to a certain extent, you said, well, we have this risk. We've got this universe of population in the past, and we've allowed the machine to train itself to distinguish the risk. And it's a pretty easy to find risk because it's there 90% of the time. And what I find interesting, and I'm curious as to whether or not, Terry, you and your organization used any of the same thing. And the challenge I see is that, of course, you're trying to find out who we trust and who we don't. And presumably there are relatively few people we would not trust. And those would be people like Aldrich Ames, who are, famous spies who've kind of compromised the nation's security and proved themselves to be untrustworthy. And so the challenge is, I imagine, I don't know, but out of, 1.2 million or 1.4 million names in your database, perhaps, I don't know, 10, 20 were the kind of the risk element in the past where we confirmed that, yes, they were not trustworthy. And so my question is whether or not either of you can offer any perspective on where we find risk in other agencies, and we want to train our tools and our people on the hypotheses about how to use the artificial intelligence to identify the risk. How do we go from the situation where it's really easy because 90% of the time it was present to, 1/100th of a percent of a time it's present? We just don't have as much information to train on. Any thoughts about how we can train for less frequent risks to use AI?
I'll start. So it seemed like it was easy. However, I forgot to mention that. So we have the accessibility law that went through. The original one was from 1973 and then went through refresh back in 2016, 17, which introduced a completely different set of words, interpretations, to the point where the law itself, I had to read it several times to even understand because there's a lot of legalese. So for a machine to understand something, human must also, of course we can't, a human mind cannot process millions of words and be able to isolate them and classify them as the machines do it. But when you read the law itself, you would hope to understand it. However, there were many meetings held with representatives from the Accessibility Board to really understand what the law meant. So because you're dealing with something that's not binary, yes or no, but with something that's a lot of times it's up to interpretation. Well, is it software? Well, what if it's not? What if it's DoD? What if it's DoD? If it's not, it's an exception. And so you go through that whole decision tree. You have to then train your model. So yes, 10% for compliance based on the old language. Think about 90% compared to now. Back in 1973, people built websites. So you might as well just take that whole training data set and say, okay, this is great. Wow, that's really cool. So it's really complicated our process of predicting. It's produced a lot of false positives, a lot of part of the first release is the database sector. And which is why this is not, you would say, completely automated, but there's a reason. And because as we launched it, the machine prediction based on the initial release of 90% of accuracy, which is really high for all text data. We also use the machine to get feedback from the coordinators and people who are reviewing it. And that's a short questionnaire, and then after they review the presentation on that slide, the machine predicts it right now. And it's specific questions so that we can then send it back, retrain the model based on that. So we never done. It's never, just because we have such a high non-compliance rate, because it is. So we have a controlled vocabulary of good work, in combination with other texts. And, but as the new law got introduced, as the scenarios get more complex, and depends on what we're dealing with as well, with respect to the quality of communications, and the content.
lose their clearance. So we can't afford to allow ourselves to get in a situation where we're making that decision lightly. And a black box is not acceptable. We have to have an evidence package. So we use more of a structured learning problem technique, so that when we're applying these data sets and looking for these patterns, we have a complete list of how the algorithm got to the recommendation it's making, and we can click on any piece of data in that decision-making chain and see it. And that gets packaged up as part of the supporting evidence of why decisions were made and recommendations were followed through by the human. So, is there value in neural networks and deep learning? Absolutely. There's some really cool stuff you can do. In fact, if you know anything about it, the accuracy rates and the repeatability rates are much higher with a deep learning algorithm than they are with the structured learning models. So there are mechanisms that you can still use to maybe inform some of your research initiatives to better understand your data. But we don't plan to use that in the actual decision-making recommendation process that we're doing in the actual business execution. We'll use that more on the research side to say, what don't we know? And how do we learn from that? Back to the feedback loop, which is a critical piece of any good AI design.
Aaron Boyd with NextGov, reporter, just to give you that fair warning. Marina, when you were talking about the bot that you're deploying, two parts to this. First off, could you give us kind of the schedule of how it was deployed, that timeline? You gave us July and what's going forward, but I wanted to get an idea of how long you've been working on this and the stages. And then secondarily, what metrics are you using to measure success? Both, you talked a little bit about keeping the AI itself honest, but also the outcomes you're looking for. In what ways are you measuring how agencies are becoming more compliant by using the tool, and have you seen any success yet?
Okay, so we started the tool development back in 2016. That's when the idea was initiated. And last year we got it to a pilot state where we were able to actually do a sort of an internal roadshow and demo it to our CIO, CTO, and other departments within GSA. And we then determined that it needed to live in cloud.gov so it could scale. And that was actually the product of GSA, so it made sense for us to host it there. So it's hosted in cloud.gov. The current schedule is that the UAT that I mentioned, user acceptance testing, will kick off in July of this year, which will comprise of several dozen of experts in accessibility for solicitation review, as well as contracting staff, because they'll also be the ones sometimes reviewing and acting on it. And we want to have an extensive UAT. So the plan is to have the UAT for at least 4 weeks to be able to get as much feedback as possible, so that we can, if there's going to be some prioritization obviously, but the tool is built. The question becomes how extensive of feedback we want to build into the very first version, how many critical elements we still need to put in order for it to be, again, we're agile, however, we all don't want to release something and then have to do something, a patch within the first 3 weeks. So we will stay agile, however, we still want to release a strong product from the get-go because it's going to be government-wide from the start. We are thinking about potentially releasing it, doing a soft launch, releasing it to the 10 agencies at first who are more compliant on that scale, if you will, who are much more familiar with accessibility but this is still, these are the sort of the decisions that we're still in the process of making. The plan is to launch the tool in September of this year, before the end of the fiscal year. That's our target. That's the first part of the questions. The second one was the success metrics. So I mentioned earlier that we have a lot of training that comes out of the Section 508 team. We have a lot of, we run an accessibility community within the federal government. ACOP, it's an accessibility community of practice, which again is federal-wide. There's a lot of events that come out of it. And also through Federal Acquisition University, we run required Section 508 trainings. Now, these are sort of the the widely known Section 508 trainings. As sort of history showed, it does not really penetrate into the quality of solicitations that are written. Why? Well, a lot of times it's someone's collateral duty to write a solicitation. They're not familiar with the law. They need to quickly get it in. It's not well reviewed because there's not one-stop shop sort of quality of solicitation review system. The quality metric that we have, or the key performance indicator for us, is to see how, from the start, this tool can make a difference. And the conversion rate that I mentioned, it was flagged as non-compliant. The flag was in the database. It got into the portal where the email was sent to the POC. The POC logged in, reviewed, acted on it. The solicitation got corrected, and then it got reposted on FedBizOps, and we picked it up within 28. We scan every 24 hours, but depending how long it took for that solicitation to be fixed, we'll pick it up eventually as an update, and hopefully that is converted to compliant. So that's the sort of the success story, and we will track that, you know, from the very first day of the launch. We're tracking it at the government-wide level, also at the agency level, so you can actually see where the needle is moving. But another sort of in the future, what we're also considering doing is, instead of catching those solicitations as they're already posted on FedBizOps, doing this before they get posted. Now, FedBizOps is in the process of being relaunched. There's a lot going on at GSA when it comes to solicitations and everything and acquisition. So we're kind of like, we're sort of trying to keep up, but we're also very aware of what it would take for us to be able to implement this before it goes on FedBizOps. And the reason for that is security. The data security right now, the security level is public. We're taking public information from FedBizOps. So we are much more open with respect to what we can choose as far as the technology is concerned. As soon as we start doing it before it goes to the market, it's a secret, right? You have to apply a completely different approach to securing that information. So it has to be more at the transactional level too before it can get posted to FedBizOps. FedBizOps runs this algorithm and kicks it back to the requester saying, we noticed that your solicitation is not compliant with X, Y, Z. So there's a whole checklist. So this is something that we're also considering in coordination and collaboration with acquisition, so that in the future, again, we don't catch them post-fact, trying to kind of do this, you know, hustle, but we do that before it even gets to the public space. So those are kind of the considerations, but again, the success itself, you know, the milestone is to launch it, then track it accordingly, tune the models to ensure that we maintain that right now. So we measured it, compliant and not compliant, because both have to be predicted. You don't just predict non-compliant, right? You predict every single solicitation as far as compliant, non-compliant, and there's always that gray area. So that gray area we have to be able to keep reducing it, and that requires a lot of algorithm training. So continuously tuning it and keeping it at 89 to 90% accuracy is also a success metric for us.
May I ask a follow-up question, and again, kind of each of you. Every effort like this presumably requires some time, perhaps some investment in compute resources from Amazon or wherever, and perhaps contractors. And so you may have to say, you know, this is going to be valuable. We should do this. So you have to maybe make a case to say it's worthwhile. And so my question is kind of, were you asked to estimate the value of these efforts beforehand? And the cheat is something actually you just kind of already shared with us, Marina, which is, you know, hey, maybe you could say, we'll have half as much litigation, and we'll save all the cost of those attorney's fees, or we'll save the cost of either redoing the work, or you know, we'll have some other sort of savings. So my question is, were you asked to identify or estimate the value of what you proposed as you began it at the first stages? And if so, how did you do that?
I was not. We were not asked. I mean, we were mandated.
I was.
Fix it.
Well, that's sometimes better, right? When you don't have to justify why something that's apparent and obvious to you needs to be fixed. when we started this process, again, there was a guy doing Python. Easy, couple of Excel spreadsheets sent to the agencies, great. When I rejoined GSA, and we've sort of through discovery, it became apparent that no, that this is not how it's going to be. We need to build it as a solution. When we went on that roadshow, as mentioned last year, the previous leadership said, wow, I didn't realize you're going to build this whole thing. I said, well, you have to build this whole thing because otherwise it's not going to work. And they said, well, we can't afford this big thing then. Which is why we went on a roadshow, offering, look what the great thing, and everybody went, wow, this is a great thing. How did you guys build it? Using open source. We built it entirely in-house, and now we have a contractor who's helping us make it better, still using open source. Well, how much is it going to be? Well, we think it's going to be this much. All right, well, keep shopping. And so the good thing is, and so at one point we got defunded. And it's a true story, we got defunded, and again, this is not something, Keith and I were joking, we don't do AIs like, AI is not on our title, right? We're not leading AI departments or divisions or groups. We are program owners that need AI in order to solve complex issues. And so we sort of the byproduct of it is we're building our own, we're spinning off our own solutions because otherwise we can't improve what we're trying to accomplish. And so when we got defunded, we had to essentially archive everything and put it in GitHub in a sitting place until we got funded again, and we were able to rebuild it in cloud.gov. So the journey that SRT has gone through is incredible, and I think if I were to write a case study about it, some people would probably say, okay, at least I'm not the only one. But don't get discouraged because squeaky wheel always gets the grease, because if this is something that is truly a game changer, which in our case it is, because think about it. I mentioned, the way to see the difference besides just looking at the SRT KPIs is we have one product that we run also using open source, scanning all the public-facing government websites for accessibility issues using WCAG 2.0, the W3C product, or guidelines rather. And so we know for every public-facing .gov website what kind of issues, accessibility issues they have. And then we communicate those issues through a government-only product on digital-dashboard.gov. So we can see, and we can actually go to those website owners and say, your website is not compliant with accessibility. Well, what do you mean? Well, there's no color contrast, so a colorblind person can't see it. You're missing image descriptions. So if you're describing a particular thing on your website and there's no image description, the blind person has no idea what's there. It just says image, and that's it. So we start communicating, and then they're starting to learn. Oh, okay. So we go back to solicitations, because you have to go to a contractor usually and say, hey, can you change the site? And they're like, okay, is it in the solicitations? Is it in the statement of work? Why didn't you mention it? So it's like a complete loop. So there are ways besides just looking at the solicitation quality. You can actually look at the product itself, like websites, and using open source again, be able to tell. And usually if your color contrast, your image descriptions are missing, and your HTML attributes are not there, guess what? Chances are, if those three are non-compliant, the rest is not compliant as well. So those are like the major indicators that everything else is probably also bad. So that's how we measure continuously the impact of what we're trying to accomplish, starting at the solicitation.
Hi, I'm David Zepper with FedScoop, also a reporter. Just a heads up, my question is for you, Terry. I want to get a sense of when your solution kind of went into place. In terms of metrics, when did you notice, or how has it sped up that process? Do you have any sort of idea how much quicker things are going? And then lastly, is it flagging, I guess, more suspicious activity or anomalies than the paper-based process was? And maybe you can't give a metric on that, but I'm wondering if, as a result, you're back-checking clearances now or anything like that.
So we've really focused on releasing the front end of the process. So the front end is you as an individual needing a clearance would fill out your form. One of the first things we saw was that the accuracy rate of the data coming in from the subject submitted form, the SF 86, 85, 85P, wasn't as high as we needed it to be. And that causes a lot of rework, and that causes your first delay in time as you go back and ask for clarification. So we put a lot of energy into that upfront piece, did some studies to figure out how to make it more, you think about doing your taxes today, most all the software programs now kind of walk you through a questionnaire, and we did a similar thing with the front end. That's where we really focused our first release, which went out back in October. We've been working behind the scenes to really try to bring all these components together in that architecture I talked about earlier. So we've spent a lot more time focused on that hygiene and some of that accreditation, trying to ease the pain of accreditation for the future by taking some work on now. That was an important piece. At the same time, we've been building out the investigative management piece. That's the piece that replaces the core mainframe that I mentioned from the legacy system side. We're not quite ready to roll that out. We're still in development. But we're pushing hard with our partners to get to that first piece end to end, which is the T1 clearances. Think of those as your suitability clearances, because that's the foundation. From there, you add more data sources as you go up in clearance level, which means more processing that happens. So that's our cornerstone to really build out the investigation piece, and then we'll build from there. We're in a continuous delivery mode where we're constantly rolling out things. So I expect that pace to pick up as we get through this big summer push with the cloud and the ATO piece and accreditation process that we've done.
So, Terry, I really appreciated your comment about how those who want to do AI should focus on the things that you need to know in order to do the AI and less on the AI itself. Particularly as someone who runs a government analytics program in which we teach students to be responsible users of AI or producers of AI. So I was wondering if you could sort of dig into that comment a little bit and talk about what are some of those dozen or so things you need to know and why they're important.
Yeah, I think it comes back to you can partner, right? The Department of Defense is huge. So we have a lot of partners. We partner with academia, we partner with industry partners who bring cool technology that does some really neat things. Not necessarily the AI itself, but the foundational things to get us there. We partner with our research arms within the Department of Defense. Think mathematicians, the mathematic modelers, people that know how to do this analysis. And then there's groups that are even the human behavior subject matter experts, right? That are the people with that true subject expertise. So we knew we had to be able to bring them together. So we said, well, what does it take to enable them to continue to do their work better, faster, and add more artificial intelligence? And by taking that approach, we realized it was bottom up. Get the data in one place, get some control over that data. If you think of a large system, it's one thing when I'm building a simple system myself and I can go get some Python folks and I can put them on there and I can quickly crank out some code that's all on one little server or one VOE, whatever you want to call it. But when you're dealing with a system of systems that are complex and have a lot of system interfaces to other systems, downstream, upstream, you really need to think about that, because wherever you allow those components to be farmed out, like if we're going to allow this agency or this component of the department to build this piece of the system, we're going to build it in a place where they can control it. That's our nature in the business, which means all the data sources they need are going to come into that component wherever it lives. So by centralizing all the components in the cloud on a common platform as a service, all of our partners who are building for us then come and build in our platform. So that was a big shift. There's people, there's acquisition and contracts that have to be structured properly to allow that to happen. There's getting the technology set up to allow them to come into their zone to do what they need to do. It may not be the test zone, it may be a special dev zone for that research work. So there's a lot of that thinking we put into it. what kind of control do we need to manage the user population across, oh, well, you're a researcher, oh, you're a developer, oh, you're a tester. And how do we map them to the zones and what data has to flow in? So back to that common data broker allows us to farm the data into the appropriate zone with the appropriate controls. So it was those fundamental technologies and skills that had to be applied. And then when we get up to the AI stuff, it was how do we provide a tool to allow them to do this? Because what I didn't want was 24 different tools doing the same function. That would be just terrible. It's too complex. I can't train on it. And I need to have that tool be able to access the data controls that I put in place. So that's how we thought about it, more from a bottom up.
Yep, it makes a lot of sense.
Well, one of the things I just want to add to this is, as we adopt emerging technologies, it's teaching the workforce as well, and also the change management program. When I talk about change management, not just from the IT perspective, but from a workforce perspective, the soft skills, the things that you need to help facilitate change, right? So I can have the best expert in the world tell me how to do something, but if the workforce does not grab onto it, if they don't buy into it, you're going to build something that they'll never use if they don't trust it, right? So this is the whole change management process. The buy-in, when Terry was talking about business requirements, when Marina was talking about involving the acquisition people that go through the process, if they don't buy into the technology and they don't trust the technology, then you spend all this money for nothing.
Yeah.
This is huge when we go through this workforce and digital transformation.
Yeah, absolutely agree. My scar tissue from the ERP days taught me that in spades. I mean, it was so difficult to deal with the change management and the communication, and it was not a core competency of the builders, right? It's a core competency of the business, and they have the relationship with the people who are trying to deal with that change. So you have to make sure that you're partnered. For me, I have a business partner lead that runs the business of background investigation and insider threat for the Department of Defense, and is taking on this new mission for the entire federal government to provide a service. So she and I are partnered on how we deal with that gray space between builders and people pushing the change management, and we call it a business support office. So it's people who came from the business, it's people who are more experienced with technology. We can train them up more in technology. They may come over and work with us closely as we're doing the agile process, but those are the people going out there and pushing change management because they know how to communicate with that workforce. They understand the lexicon. And then the second piece of it is governance. There's that fear factor I mentioned early on. Those are also the people that can help you implement governance. Because what you don't want is the wild, wild west of AI algorithms out there, right? You have to put some controls in place, even in the research space. If they're going to test 101 machine learning classifiers, how are you going to track the fact that you now have 101 new classifiers sitting on that development or research instance? How are you going to know which ones are good, which ones aren't? How are you going to inventory them? How are you going to lock them down? Who has access to them? All the governance pieces, once you make a decision, say, this one worked, and I want to move it over there. Who made that decision? Did they have the authority to make that decision? It's not the developer. So use that space between the people using and trying to deal with the change and the people building to come up with a mechanism that works within your organization, whatever it is, to deal with change management and governance around this stuff.
Let me interject with just a brief advertisement, which is for a speaker for an upcoming breakfast forum. I'm looking for candidates. And what I'm particularly interested in is 2 or 3 folks who can say, we built a better mousetrap, we have a great analytic product, and you know what? It's dramatically increased use of analytics, adoption and use of analytics in day-to-day roles. Because what I found in my experience is that many times someone will build a great mousetrap, a fantastic analytic tool, and they can't get their colleagues to pay attention to the results. And so what I'm hoping is to find a couple of agencies where an analytics program has been implemented and seen a huge uptake in use of analytics. And so if anybody has suggestions for what agency or what person, I would love to hear that. I'm going to try and assemble a panel of 2 or 3 folks to kind of address that topic. How did they get that use to increase and that kind of that change adoption to happen?
I can give you NASA. You should contact someone at NASA.
Okay.
So with the introduction of digital analytics program, which is government-wide, making it basically a shared service where the agencies don't have to pay, GSA procures and pays. We've seen an incredible uptick in how people use analytics, and I think I can think of like NASA is one because they basically overnight switched from web logs to JavaScript-based tracking, being able at the time when they were still launching shuttles, they were able to see real-time statistics on their web, on the NASA.gov and NASA TV. So I highly encourage someone from NASA to speak to this.
Question.
Hi, my name is Raphael Jones. I work at the Office of Personnel Management. You guys might be familiar with us. Particularly in my BI or BS, I guess, for you guys. So I have a two-part question, and it's for one. The first part is for the panel. The second part is for you, Terry. So the first part is, as we talk about change management, the team that Eric and I are on is called Strategic Workforce Foresight Team, SWIFT. And we're increasingly being tasked, and our organization is increasingly being tasked with helping human capital programs understand the what is coming and what is here as it relates to automation. So I would ask the panel to give me some ideas or help us understand how we can facilitate the change management thinking in this, part one. Part two, to you, Terry, is you said earlier on that no decision would be made by a machine. That's encouraging, but I'm probably wrong, but I'm going to run this by you anyway. And of course, this could also be answered by the panel. I was under understanding that there are certain aspects of artificial intelligence that actually kind of start to develop on its own, right? And so when you talk about your trusted partners, will there be mechanisms in place, or will the mechanisms remain in place to where a trusted partner has a defined definition and that defined definition doesn't change? In other words, the algorithm won't, out of the blue, determine what is trusted and what isn't. So, long questions, but please.
Okay.
Change management first.
Change management first. So I think part of the thing when we look at workforce transformation from agency to agency, there's culture that has been developed over time within each agency. So understanding the culture, adopting a change management, meaning that if you're going to implement a change management solution within an organization, you're going to have what I call the bidding exercise. You're going to have the people who are the naysayers. You're going to have the ones that are on the fence. You're going to have the ones that are bought into technology, right? So if we go through this, and if you know you're going to be faced with that issue, you're going to have to figure out how to communicate and collaborate within the organization, and who are those key stakeholders that can drive and help you move the agency in the right direction, right? So you're going to have leaders that will help. But I think from a whole of agency approach and whole of government approach, you have to look at from bottom up. You can't affect change just with one person. It will take you to work at all levels within the organization and building a really good, cohesive, strong team to actually do that change management process within an organization. And because we basically have silos, right? You got your CXOs, and you have these people who have their different mission areas. But in technology and the way everything is converging, you're gonna have these crossovers, and it's gonna be a little bit difficult. And this is why high collaboration is going to be needed internally to the agencies, as well as external, because you're going to find common themes in the lines of business that can help you rapidly move through the process. It's just like Marina's project is the first off the ground for acquisitions. Well, there's a lot of things that have been learned and have been documented that can be repeatable to build out those modules even quicker. And for example, from a distributed ledger technology perspective, I can take a lot of those documented processes, a lot of the things that have already been done, and build quicker. So it'll get faster over time, but the first is always the longest colon 10, right?
I think both, right? So I've had success in my past and this job using marketing campaigns, very targeted to campaign different concepts and educate people. Think of it as an education step. And also the skunk work project. I mean, where you put something together quick. Classic example in the ERP days was, I've got all this data now in one big repository, and you go to somebody and say, great, what kind of dashboards would you like to see? They just kind of look at you. Like, well, what do you mean? Like, what do you want to see on the screen? And getting them to actually put those requirements down is hard because they don't really even know. I mean, it's hard. You got to teach them what the art of the possible is with the data you have and what is the data saying and is the data worthy? Is it good enough? Now today with artificial intelligence, we can normalize and get some of that rogue data out of the way and make better information out of data than we could in the past. But it's the same challenge. They don't always know what they want. So Skunkworks helps to educate and also marketing campaigns to go out and really think about targeted education.
Trusted partners in I know we don't have much time, but trusted partners in algorithms, Frankenstein algorithms.
Again, there's some great books out there. If you want a good book, see me afterwards. I have one I really recommend. It's simple to read. You don't have to have a degree in AI or computer science to understand it. It speaks of the 6 camps of AI. And again, they're all very different in the way they approach the problem. So you have to make conscious choices as to what kind of AI best serves your business challenge that you're presented. And then you need to work with your business folks to educate them on the pluses and minuses of each one. And back to, what is your final output you're looking for? Is it just to better understand your data? Or is it to make a recommendation that literally affects somebody's life, right? And again, we will not use a black box algorithm. I'm not going to do it for that mission. Now, could I use it to educate us better on what's in the data? Okay, yeah. And I might want to compare it against other things. But those are choices that you need to work through, whatever your process is in your agency, to get the right people at the table. And I'm going to tell you, the right people aren't just the technologists in the business. You need some ethics people, you need some lawyers, you need some other people, or maybe behavioral scientists. You need a good mix of people to make sure you're making the best decision you can. Back to governance. Don't let it be the wild, wild west of AI algorithms.
So I think we've come a little past our 10 o'clock stop, and I'd like to try and be respectful of our speakers' time as well as yours. But please join me in thanking Terry and Keith and Marina.